the question is, and
We stacked the
deck big
Yeah,
time
we did.
on this one. Okay.
Well, we haven't been getting questions, and I don't know if it's because we haven't promoted it well enough, or
We have a smart audience.
they just don't care.
They know it all. They know everything.
Or they want to see what we're going to come up with just randomly. But if you do have a question that you would like him to do a little research
Hi,
on,
Stephanie.
to do something, there's something you've always wanted to know, then please let us know. You don't have to put it in the comments anywhere. You can email it to Don. It's don@troymillschristian.church. I want to make sure I get that right. don@troymillschristian.church. You can send him an email with a question. But this one got me thinking a little bit. Before I married you, there was a lot of stuff I didn't know.
Me
I
too.
learned...
There's a lot of stuff I didn't know, too. Okay?
But we still got married.
And we still got married, yeah.
But there were a lot of things that we did not have in common.
Right.
We did not come from similar backgrounds. We did not root for the same baseball teams. And that has not changed. We still don't root for the same baseball team.
I'm still the Christian.
He pulls that every time. It's not, whatever. But one of the things we did have in common was that we were both kind of history buffs.
Mm-hmm.
We both, now there's different sections of history. I liked different things than he does, but we both love history. I was only a couple credits shy of a history minor. But this particular question is not so much about what is in the Bible, but what isn't in the Bible. When I first read, or when I was younger and was reading through the Bible, and I got to the last book of the Old Testament, Malachi, I would just flip the page, and there I was in Matthew in the New Testament. And never really thought about the fact that there was something that happened between Malachi and Matthew. A little bit.
A lot.
So
yeah.
our question tonight for you
Okay.
is, what happened in that page between Malachi and Matthew?
Well, first of all, it's about 400 years.
It's a big page.
Okay, it's 4 centuries that existed between the last prophet of the Old Testament. Well, the next to the last. And I'm going to open up a can of worms. John the Baptist was actually the last Old Testament prophet.
Interesting.
Okay? But the next to the last Old Testament prophet was Malachi.
So now we have another question for next week.
Another question for next week.
Why
yeah.
was John the
Why
Baptist
is-
an Old Testament prophet?
Yeah.
But go ahead.
Well, and so Malachi was the last writer, and then there was 400 years before Jesus.
Okay.
Okay. And that happens to be one of my favorite periods of history.
I knew this.
Okay. There's a passage of scripture that Paul wrote in Galatians chapter 4 that says, "But when the set time had fully come, God sent his son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those under the law, that we might receive adoption to sonship." Some translations will say, and this is my favorite phrase, that in the fullness of time, God sent his son. This whole phrase of the fullness of time, that the fullness of time, what needed to happen is that God had to orchestrate 400 years of history. 600 years before Jesus was born, the Jews went into captivity to the Babylonian exile is what it's called in scriptures. And this was because they had disobeyed the things of God for a long time and had to endure 70 years of exile. So the Babylonians, King Nebuchadnezzar, most of the book of Daniel is written during this time. Matter of fact, Daniel chapter 2 or 3, it talks a lot about Nebuchadnezzar.
Yes.
But then you get a little bit later in the book of Daniel, and there's a coup. And the Medes and the Persians overthrow the Babylonian government. The Nebuchadnezzar's son was the king by that time. They killed him, and they began to rule over the Jews and over the land of Babylonia, which would be Iraq, Iran, Persia, that part of the world that we would know of today, all the way down almost into Israel and into Egypt. But the first king of the Persians was a guy named Cyrus. Okay, now 150 years. This is why I like this. 150 years before Cyrus became the king, the Old Testament prophet Isaiah wrote about him. Matter of fact, he called him by name.
That's the part.
In Isaiah 45, 750 years before Jesus, Isaiah wrote Cyrus, and he says, God's anointed servant. And what was he anointed for? Well, Cyrus was going to be the king that allowed the Jews to leave captivity and return to their homeland, to Jerusalem. And so that's where we get the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, and then the book of Esther all happened under the Persian rule. And we see different things that are going on. But the Jews, Ezra takes a group of people back to Jerusalem, and they're told to rebuild the temple. And the temple was the first thing to be rebuilt so that God would have a dwelling place in the midst of his people. And then Nehemiah was to go back and miraculously built the wall in 52 days. And there's some incredible things in there.
I know, I love that book.
And then the book of Esther talks about the rule of the Persians and how great and mighty they were, and how God preserved his people, the Jews, through miracle after miracle after miracle.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of cool. Well, the Persians ruled. The Jews rebuilt Jerusalem. They rebuilt the walls. They rebuilt the temple. They populated the city. And it was all kind of functioning very, very well. Now, let me stop right here for a second, because the Babylonians had a habit of, they took the kings of Israel and just let them live in the palace, eating the food. They didn't put them in prison. They didn't do anything like that. But the Medes and the Persians, they said, well, man, if we let these people go back and rebuild their city, and start planting crops and start becoming industrious, and we're going to be able to make some money from the taxes that are generated from their income. And so that was the way the Medes treated the Jews. Well, this gets to be more favoriter parts of this story, is that I love the Babylonians, I love the Medes and the Persians, but about 300 years before Jesus was born, my favorite character comes along, and that's Alexander the Great.
These are not really nice people.
These are not. No,
it's not like he likes them because they're nice.
Cyrus was not a godly man. Cyrus was a jerk. Okay, and the book of Esther talks about sex trafficking and just abuse of women and drunkenness and genocide. It is a terrible time, and the world's just getting. That's the other thing to keep in mind, is that the world is getting worse and worse and worse, and so here comes Alexander the Great, and he rules the world by the time he's 26. Of course, he dies by the time he's 26, and he has no heirs that he knew of. He had one that was on the way when he died, but he didn't know it. Okay, and so he divided his kingdom up between 4 of his generals. The 2 generals that really matter for us are a general by the name of Ptolemy, who got basically what we think of as Egypt. And then there's another guy who was wicked man called Seleucus, and he got Israel and Syria and that part of the world. Those 2 guys fought over Israel and the Jews for years. I mean, just terrible battles. For a while, the Seleucids would rule, then the Ptolemies would rule, then they would fight again, and they would switch and switch and switch. I am so sorry. And so it was a pretty ugly time in the history, but it starts getting now Alexander the Great, and here's why I like him a lot. He was a bum, okay, and he just bowled over the world and ruled over the world. But he did things that you can see God orchestrating in the way that he used Alexander the Great. I'm going to try to say this without doing it with my hands. Okay, I know. Okay,
Why?
I don't know why. So he brings, and the best thing that he does is that he leaves the world with one language,
Mm-hmm.
Greek.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody in the world that Alexander had conquered
Mm-hmm.
was left with speaking Greek. It became the language of the Jews. It became the language that everybody used. Even the Romans, even though they spoke probably Italian, they still would speak Greek.
Mm-hmm.
He built libraries in
Mm-hmm.
Alexandria. Phenomenal advances in the world. And he loved the Jews somehow. Okay. Matter of fact, the miracle of anyway, that's we don't want to do that. But so Alexander dies.
It's another time.
Seleucus and Ptolemy begin to fight, and and then Seleucus rules, and the Jews is under, and one of my heroes is this old Jewish priest, a grizzled old guy called Judas, who is the hammer. He's the hammer, the Maccabees. And there starts this series of battles. It's the first known guerrilla warfare in the history of the world, where the Maccabean family begins to fight and resist the Jews and the Seleucids, and they would hit them and pull back. They'd hide. They'd hit them and pull back, and then this went on for years and years. And finally, the Seleucids said, "We've had it. You win,"
Hmm.
and they just pulled away. It took about 100 years, but they wore them out. I don't know that you could say they defeated them, but they wore them out. And so the Maccabees now. But then this is where part of it gets really tragic. There's a family of Jewish priests called the Hasmoneans, and there's two brothers in this family that can't get along.
That's so unusual.
and and one has an army and the other one has an army, and they start fighting. And so one of the brothers makes contact with a relatively new figure. He's a Roman general by the name of Pompey.
Mm.
And he makes a deal with Pompey that Pompey would come in and help him defeat his brother so that he could rule over the Jewish people, and then Pompey would go away. Well,
Yeah.
Pompey decided he didn't want to go away.
Now, when he saw what he could get.
And so sometime 50, 60, 70 years before Jesus is born, Pompey takes over the Jews. And in 37 years, and we know some of this stuff because it's very well documented history.
Yeah, this is real deal.
And so in 37 years before Jesus is born, the Romans appoint Herod the Great to become the ruler over the Jews. He was the king when Jesus was born. He was maniacal, okay? And just incredibly mentally ill and off balance and ruthless in his dealing with people. The account of him killing all of the baby boys in Bethlehem that were 2 years and under was very typical of the things that Herod hated the Jews. Okay? Now, it's also interesting to note that Herod was a descendant of Esau.
Oh, yes. We go back
Okay,
to
so
that
you go
again.
back to the Jacob and Esau issues. Herod was an Edomian, and Edomians were Edomites, and the Edomites were the descendants of Esau.
Speaking of two brothers who didn't get along.
Two
very
brothers
well.
who didn't get along, Jacob and Esau. Yeah. So we've got this whole thing that's set up, and
Where was
so
God during this whole time?
where was God? God didn't. Okay, God was orchestrating all these
Sure.
things. This time is called the 400 years of silence.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, if you read it's in biblical history books. It's it's easy to find it, called 400 years of silence, because there was no active prophet
Okay.
for 400 years.
Mm-hmm.
But man, was God at work.
Yes.
Orchestrating this nation and this nation and this general and bringing this into existence and getting rid of that and all of these kinds of things, so that when Paul wrote Galatians 4, he says, with this incredible understanding of the Jewish history, he says that in the fullness of time, when everything was ready, God sent his son. So what had to be ready? Now, I have a different take on this, all right? What had to be ready was that there had to be a government ruling the Jews who would kill by crucifixion.
Mm-hmm. By
Now,
hanging from a tree.
Alexander just would have run him over with an elephant.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
The Babylonians would have just thrown him in jail and let him rot. And the Persians would have, well, we can get some benefit out of him. But it was only the Romans who, because of the way they chose to rule over the Jews, they basically got blackmailed into crucifying Jesus. Mm-hmm. Pilate didn't see any reason to. Nobody saw any reason to, other than the hatred that the Jews had towards the Messiah. And that was inspired by hell. Mm-hmm. This is a battle of heaven and hell.
That's right.
The kingdom of God
All
and
along.
the kingdom
Mm-hmm.
of hell. And so in order for Jesus to be crucified, now if you go back and you read, Jesus fulfilled, there were 300 prophecies of the Old Testament fulfilled in the betrayal, in the crucifixion and the death and the resurrection and everything about. There's 300 Old Testament prophecies fulfilled.
His birth too.
His birth was part, but they went back hundreds of years, centuries. I mean, Isaiah wrote 700 years. So the suffering servant in Isaiah 53, where Isaiah said that he would be beaten beyond human recognition. Only the Romans would have done that.
Yes.
None of those other nations would have done that. Only the Romans would have beaten Jesus beyond human recognition. No other nation would have done it. And so the Romans had to be in place before the fullness of time came about, because the prophets prophesied that Jesus would be killed on a cross. He'd be betrayed. He'd be crucified. He would have these trials, and even to the point of they cast lots for his clothing. Right. Mm-hmm. And even to where a tomb that he was buried in. He'd be buried with the rich. He'd be hung with the murderers and the criminals, buried with the rich. And they would cast lots for his, and so it had to be the Romans. And that for 400 years, God is orchestrating time to bring about his word. Mm-hmm. Now, there is just so much truth in that. And I just did 3 hours in 15 minutes, okay?
Yes.
That is unbelievable.
I told him, when I asked him to do this question, his eyes lit up, but I said, but it has to be the Reader's Digest version. We don't have all night. Yeah. And you did great.
Okay.
You did great.
But here's the takeaway for me on this. And I love studying this, because if God can orchestrate, I forgot to count, but it's the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Seleucids, the Ptolemies, the Jews, the Romans. If God can orchestrate the movements of 7 governments over 400 years of time in order to bring his son Jesus to come and to die on a cross and to be resurrected in 3 days, if God can do that in that time, he can take care of me.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
He can take care of every one of us.
That's right.
He can take care of you. And I promise you that God is more than able to take care of you. And he's not done orchestrating things.
And the other thing that I took away from when I was listening to you was sometimes we don't think we hear God. We think he's silent. That, God, where are you? But he's there doing his thing behind the scenes that we can't see, working and moving people and places and governments so that when the right time comes, we're ready. What are they laughing at us?
I love it when you talk with your hands. Thanks, Kim.
I'm holding mine together in my lap, so I don't smack them in the head.
I'm not Italian. I'm Irish. I don't know what Irish people. Well, I know what some of the Irish people do, but I don't do that either. So,
well, you did a great job.
I get so excited about this time because God is orchestrating that in the fullness of time, fullness of time for my life, and the fullness of time for your life.
That's right.
I mean, I could even do that with how you and I met.
Oh, yes. That's a whole nother
That's
night.
a whole other story. Yeah.
We'll just do that.
That was a great night. But,
it was.
Yeah. Well, never mind.
Now they'll want to know.
No.
We'll have to do that another time.